to do something? Have a response. Has God ever asked you to do something? Now the more important question. How did you respond? I'm sure if I was to go around the room, you can see, while we're sitting here in a church setting, you're going to tell me the stuff that you think I want to hear. But if I was to dig a little bit deeper, chances are you probably didn't respond too favorably to what God actually asked you. I mean, let's face it, it's human nature, it's our sinful nature. When God wants us to do something, our brain takes over and goes, sorry God, I want to run in a million miles in the other direction. It's human nature, it's our sinful nature. This morning, I want to look at a story that I'm sure most of you are very familiar with, and I'm sure you could recite to me very quickly, very easily. But maybe after this morning, you may realize you didn't know it quite as well as you thought you did. And it's probably the reason why I've entitled the sermon this morning, God's amazing plan for you is a pebble. You know, when God tells us amazing things that He wants us to do, we in our minds, we imagine grandeur, we imagine this amazing stuff. And then God turns around and says, oh, but do this, by the way. It's like, really, God? Like, have I missed something along the way? If you have your Bibles, please turn with me to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 17. We'll be spending most of the time here this morning. Like I said, this is a story that most of you could probably recite to me off by heart. But I think after this morning, you might discover that there's a little bit more to this story than what you may actually know. I'm picking up the story in verse 3. So 1 Samuel chapter 17, and I'm picking it up in verse 3. The Philistines stood still on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley in between them. And a champion went out and came of the camp of Philistines, named Goliath, and from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, we'll go through this little bit and just sort of explain who he really was. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with coat of mail, with the weight of a coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like the weaver's beam, and an iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Now let me pause there for a moment. In this day and age, the way we fight battles and wars is very different to what they did back then. Back then, you would get two armies, they would get face to face, and then, I guess somebody said go or charge or whatever it was, and it was on. They would go crazy at each other. They very quickly realized, because the population wasn't as big as we have now. So if you have a small country, let's say you had 50,000 soldiers, and the other army had 50,000 soldiers, and your weapons are shields, swords, spears, it's going to do a lot of damage. Now, you imagine when these two armies run into each other, there's going to be a lot of casualties on either side. And so they very quickly developed a system back then where they would pick a champion. Each army would pick a champion, and these two champions, these two soldiers, warriors, would come out and have a battle, and whoever won, whoever killed the other person, that gave that army the victory, and the other army conceded, because it was better for them to concede than to lose stacks and stacks and stacks of people in the process. So this is what was happening here. Now, we always talk about Goliath, but let's break him down a little bit. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he's armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels. When you convert that, that's roughly about 50 kilos. Roughly. Now, for those of you who've been on a Pathfinder camp out and have taken, hiking packs that have been 10, 15 kilos, how do you feel after a couple of hours of walking? You're wrecked. You're stuffed. Now, imagine this guy. He had to have been big enough and strong enough to be able to carry 50 kilos of just armor and still be able to be proficient in a battle and move around. He was big, he was scary, he was strong. It's no wonder the Israelites were scared of him. But we'll keep going. Then I'll go down to verse 7. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. The best way I can describe that in terms of size, have you ever seen show jumping? Yeah? It was about the size of one of those things that the horses jump over. So about that big. So this thing was huge. And the actual weight of it was about just over 6 kilos, just the head of the spear. Now you imagine how much strength you needed to lift something like this and even more to actually use it proficiently in a battle. He was a formidable figure. And it was the reason they chose him, because when Israel saw him, of course they were scared. They were petrified. But it's interesting what he says. Let's go down to verse 8. Actually, before I do that, there's one part of this that we always miss. End of verse 7. And a shield bearer went before him. See, this guy was so big and he was so tough and big and strong that they had to pick some poor, we'll use the word volunteer, or, conscripted volunteer, if I can use that term, that this poor guy had to walk in front of Goliath holding his shield. That's how big he was. I can imagine this was not something people stuck their hand up to volunteer gladly for. I would imagine this was probably like, you did something wrong in the army. Guess what your punishment is? You've got to hold the shield for Goliath. Have fun. I can imagine that wasn't a job you wanted to do. That was a job you probably tried to avoid at all costs. But it's interesting what Goliath says here. Verse 8. Then he stood and cried out at the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." I want to touch on one little point. When we as people go against God, openly challenge God, openly defy God, God will answer. And it won't end well for you. Every example we have of the Bible where that's happened, where someone has challenged and defied God, God has answered, and it hasn't ended well for them. It really hasn't. So just keep that in mind. We'll keep going. We'll miss a few chapters and we'll keep going down with the story. See, these battles that happened, they weren't something that took place in a matter of hours. These fights, they would sometimes go for months, where the two armies were camped up against each other, and every few days they'd have a few skirmishes here or there before the final battle really happened. So this stuff went on for ages. Now we're told that David's brothers were part of this army. And so they've gone down. And at this point in time, David is back looking after some of the sheep at his father's house. Now, his father's getting worried because he hasn't heard any news from the battlefront, wondering, whether the armies, are they alive? Are they successful? Are they, what's happening? So he tells David, he said, "Hey, David, I want you to go down to the army, take some supplies, give me some news, see what's happening with these guys, what's happening with the battle." And so off David goes. He does his own thing. And we pick up the story. We'll go down to verse 20. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up a battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of Philistine, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them. And what we're told next, the anger of David is aroused. He's annoyed, he's angry. See, up until this point in time, the Goliath has come out, and all the Israelite soldiers, they just freaked. They've looked at the problem, they've looked at gone, here's this big, scary, horrible looking thing that has spears and swords and all sorts of stuff. He can really do some damage to me. I want nothing to do with this. I want absolutely nothing to do with this problem. Has God asked you to do something? Are you facing a problem in your life where instead of coming up with a solution, you're looking at the problem going, this is big, this is scary, I can't do this. I'm running away. See, I believe God has allowed this story to happen so that He, through it, can teach us about how He works and how to deal with problems and issues on planet Earth. So David's going around, he can hear this guy carrying on, and he is annoyed. He is really annoyed. Allow me to ask you the question. If you see and hear God's name being slandered, being attacked, do you get annoyed? Or don't you care? See, the closer connection we have with God, the more annoyed we are when God's name is taken in vain. When God is being slandered, when God is being attacked, it bugs us. It's like, hang on, no, we can't do this. No, that's not happening. And this is what's happened to David here. He's turned around and gone, hey, this guy is challenging God. We need to do something about this. We can't just let this go. We need to call him out on it. And so he's wandering around talking to different people, and they're telling him all the same thing. But then something interesting happens. Verse 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and your insolence, and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Have you ever wondered why this statement was said? See, when we face a problem in life, the devil brings distractions so we can't focus on what God wants us to do. Eliab here wasn't necessarily having a go at David. He was feeling the guilt and the shame because he wasn't strong enough to do something about it and stand up to Goliath. And so now the person that is doing something about it, to try and make himself feel somewhat kind of better, he's trying to bring down. The devil does bring distractions in your life. When there's a problem, he usually tries to get somebody that's close to you, a family member, a friend, to go along these lines and turn around and go, hey, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing this. Because the devil knows that we're more likely to listen to those people that we have a good connection with, a close connection with. And so sometimes the devil uses them to try and distract us, to try and bring us down. And when it comes to looking at problems, David was going, hey, God said this guy needs to be challenged. I'm challenging him. Let's go. How often are we of that attitude when God says something? How often are we of the attitude when God says something, you go, yep, I'm here, God, let's go. Let's do this. I'd love to say we all do that, but the reality is we don't. I know I have it many times. You know, God says, go do something. It's like, God, really? Do I have to? And we start coming up with a whole bunch of excuses and reasons as to why. And I think sometimes, just like with Moses, God turns around and says, all right, enough excuses, enough trying to justify it. Go do it. And see what happens. But the story continues. Let's jump down to verse 32. Then David said to Saul, so David's asking questions about this, going, hey, we need to fight this guy. And word has gotten back to King Saul. And verse 32, then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. See, David here isn't turning around going, oh, it's the pastor's job to sort out this problem. Oh, it's the elder's job to sort out this problem. It's the conference president's job to sort out this problem. David stuck his hand up and gone, God said I need to do it, let's do it. End of story. Oh, if we all had that attitude and that love for God, when God turned around and says, does something, we immediately stick our hand up and go, yep, let's go. Imagine the reformation that would happen within our churches. Imagine. But then something interesting happens. Verse 33, and Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine or fight with him, for you are a youth and he is a man of war. You know, once again the distraction. Saul saying, dude, you're a teenager. He's been fighting all his life. You're going to get slaughtered. Like, it's not even going to be a fight. But David said to him, and said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went after it, I struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. There's a very big lesson in here on what David just said. When you're facing a problem, when you're facing an issue, recall the times that God has been on your side. Recall the times that God has done stuff for you. That's what David's doing here. He can see the problem. He's going, God's helped me in the past with these problems. This is going to be no different. It strengthens our faith. It reassures us that, hey, God's come through in previous engagements. He'll come through now. But so often, we forget about that. We forget about what God has done for us. You know, it's amazing to hear other stories about how God has worked for them. But what has God done for you? What has God done for you? Now, I should probably pause here and explain. This doesn't necessarily mean always that it's going to be some big, massive, crazy thing. Sometimes it's tiny stuff. Stuff that you probably look at it and go, that has absolutely no point of relevance to anything whatsoever. I'll give you an example. On New Year's, we were down at Burleigh to watch the fireworks, and me not completely forgetting it's New Year's, good luck finding a car park on the Gold Coast just before the fireworks start. So I've been, looping around, probably for about close to half an hour, and it got to the point, it's like, God, can you find me a car park? This is ridiculous. A few minutes later, a car pulled out in front of me, and I managed to pull in. Does that have any sort of significance in the scheme of things? No, it doesn't. But it's a tiny little piece of evidence that I can look and go, God had my best interests at heart, and he helped me. Likewise in your life. See, when we fall into the trap quite often that we go, oh, but I'll only see God working in the big stuff. But let's be honest, how much big stuff is there in your life? Probably not that much. Education, work, school, house, marriage, car, kids, retirement, health issues. There's probably not too many big things that we would call in life. And they don't happen every single day of the week. You don't graduate a university course every single day of the week. You don't get married every single day of the week. You don't buy a house every single day of the week. What about the bits in between the big stuff? The mundane bits, the day that I got up, I had breakfast, I went to work, had lunch, continued working, came home, went to bed. What about those days? The bits that just are not exciting in any way, shape, or form. What about those bits? Look for what God's done for you. In fact, I want to give you a challenge. As you go away from here, every day, try to find 3 things that God has done for you in that day. No matter how big, how small, how irrelevant you think they might be. But intentionally look for things that God has done for you. You'll be surprised at what you actually start discovering. See, the problem is we don't look for the things that God does for us, so we miss it. So we only look for the stuff that, hey, I had a near-death experience, that was amazing. We don't notice the little stuff. Couple of months ago, I was driving down the road. For those of you who don't know, I drive trucks. It was a hot day, so I'd taken off my jumper and put it on the back of the truck as I was doing a delivery. Completely forgot about it, jumped in the truck and took off. Got to the next place where I was doing the delivery. The jumper had caught in one of the little pins in the back of the truck, right at the edge, stopping it from falling off. Was that a God thing? Yeah, it was. Was it a big, important, crazy thing? No. It's probably insignificant in the scheme of things, but it's a little piece of evidence that I can look back and go, hey, God was actually looking after me. And I can guarantee you in your own lives, if you start being intentionally and actually looking for God and the things that He does, you will see it. You will see it on a daily basis. You will see it everywhere. I promise you that much. Try it and see. But the story doesn't finish there. Verse 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor and put on a bronze helmet on his head, and he also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened the sword into his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these. I have not tested them. How often when there's a problem, instead of turning to the God of heaven for the solution, we turn to other people. Sometimes those solutions will be good. Other times, not so much. Sometimes they can be a hindrance. And the other aspect of this, the only armor we need to be putting on is found in Ephesians chapter 6. The armor of God. That's the only armor we are to be putting on. No other counterfeit, no other sort of armor that the devil offers us are we to put on. God is our only protection. And if God doesn't protect us, how does that verse go? It's pointless for a watchman to watch a city if God doesn't protect the city. If God is not protecting you, nothing this world offers is going to protect you. Jesus is the only safe. He is the only safe. Wherever Jesus is, that's safe. And if Jesus is not with you and within you, then you're bordering on unsafe. That's the reality. That's the only armor. That's the only plan we need to have. Now, when David took off the armor and said, I can't fight these, what do you think everybody around him was thinking? Dude, you are completely nuts. Like, the only protection Saul has given you, you've just removed that, and now you're going up to fight against that thing. When God tells you to do something, chances are it won't necessarily make sense to others. Because God told you to do it, not others. Just keep that in mind. Sometimes when God asks us to do stuff, it's mind-boggling. It doesn't make sense. It's big, it's scary, it's horrible, it's, all this stuff we want to avoid. But if God said to do it, then we'd be wise to listen. Because there are many, many verses where we even read a couple today that says, God says, I will be with you. Do not be afraid. Do not worry. I've got you. I've got your back. I will protect you. I will fight on your behalf. But sadly, we have a tendency to forget that more often than not. Now, I think at this point in time, we are not told, but I get the impression that David still didn't have a solution for all this. I don't know if you've ever picked up on this. I don't believe that at this point in time, David still had how this is going to play out. All he had was, go fight this guy. And he's like, right, yep, let's go. But the details weren't necessarily there. See, we as humans, we love to know the why. We love to know all the information. The reality is, the majority of the time, God doesn't give us the why. He just gives us the, go do it. The reason He doesn't give us the why is because we have to trust Him. We have to step out in faith. Because if He was to give us all the information, we wouldn't want anything to do with God because we know everything. And so God deliberately doesn't give us a lot of the information so that we trust him, so that our faith grows because we trust him. We look back and go, hey, I didn't know all those bits and pieces, but hey, God sorted that out. That's the beauty of it. Let's go down to verse 42. And when the Philistine looked about, he saw David. He disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. This guy was offended. He's just like, are you serious? Like, I came here to fight some champion, some hardened warrior and soldier, and you're sending out a little teenager with a stick? Like, really? Like, he was furious. He was fuming. And we're told in Ellen White that at this moment, because of this, he's pushed his helmet up above his head. His safety and protection, because as far as he's concerned, this guy's got a tiny little stick. Like, well, what on earth is he going to do to me? He's not even as big as my shield. Like, I'll just look at him and he'll fall over. But the story continues. And the Philistine said to David, come to me and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, and I want you to take note of this response. See, David here isn't boasting on his own strength. Verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. The battle is the Lord's. No matter what your problems you are facing, the battle is the Lord's. He's the one that's going to sort it out. He's the one that's going to fight on your behalf. He's the one that's going to make things work even if you do not understand how, when, where, or why. The battle is the Lord's. How often have we tried to sort out a problem on our own? How well has it worked? If we're honest, most of the time we can turn around and say, yeah, it didn't end so well. The battle is the Lord's. When God calls us to do something, when God calls us to go somewhere, he wants us to do so with the presence of Jesus there next to us so God can fight on our behalf. See, one thing about prayer that we tend to miss quite often, part of prayer is giving God permission to do his thing and to work. By me turning around saying, hey Jesus, I need you here, can you help me with this? Jesus turns around and goes, you beauty, someone's asked me for permission, I'm there. I'll sort this out. But more often than not, we try and do it on our own. And when things get horrible, when things get intense, then somewhere along the way, further down, it's like, God, help, I'm drowning, what do I do? Just like Peter. He was great while he was watching Jesus. He was walking on water. He was doing something that should be impossible. What happened the second he took his eyes off Jesus? Went straight down. Same thing happens to us. If we don't go into this world, if we don't face the problems of this world without Jesus, we are going to sink incredibly fast. And then wonder where things went so horribly wrong. Verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. As we keep going, we're told that, we'll go down to verse 48. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in the bag and took out a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine in the forehead, so that the stone sank in the forehead and he fell on the face of the earth. Now, oftentimes when we tell this story, we use the analogy of a slingshot. It actually wasn't a slingshot like you and most of us would know in this day and age. It was generally a piece of fabric or a piece of leather that they would hold. It was probably about that long, and they would put an object, a rock, an implement or something in the center of it, and then they would spin it as fast as they can, and then release one end, and the projectile would come flying out. Now you can imagine this obviously would need to take an awful lot of practice to get any kind of accuracy for that to happen. And we're actually told that this was a strategy that armies used to use back then. They used to use these guys with slings just to really annoy and do damage to the other armies, because they could get in close, do damage, and then run away without getting attacked by a sword or something. And this is what David did. And we're told in the carelessness of Goliath, in him, and I believe this was God doing what he did. He moved the helmet. He guided this stone into the giant's forehead and made him collapse and killed him. And then just to add injury, just to prove the victory to the Philistines that God is bigger, David runs over, grabs the sword of Goliath and cuts his head off and lifts it up to the Philistines' army going, this is what God can do. This is what God can do. Whatever problem you are facing, whatever challenge you are facing in life, if you allow Jesus to fight on your behalf, he will sort things out, and by the end of it, you'll be able to say, this is what God can do. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter the problem, doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter the circumstances. God is bigger, God is stronger, God is more powerful than you, your problems, and the devil. And if we let him, he will win every single time. But the thing to keep in mind is that victory isn't necessarily going to be according to the idea that's in my head. And I need to make note of this. And it's something we need to get. See, oftentimes when we see a problem, we come to God, instead of asking for God's solution, we turn around and give God our solution and essentially want him to put his signature on it so it happens that way. You know, we turn around and go, okay, God, here's the problem. This is what needs to happen. This is when it needs to happen. Can you like hurry up and do it? God answers prayers. He fixes problems. He fixes you. He fixes your life. But he does it in his way, and he does it in his time. That doesn't mean that God is not working. It just means that God's working outside of the idea I have in my head of how things are supposed to happen. And let's face it, God sees and knows things that we don't. So who am I to turn around and tell God how to do his job? You know, that's like a little 5-year-old boy turning around and telling an engineer who's developing an aircraft how to do his job properly. The engineer's going to turn around and laugh. Same as with us when we turn around and tell God how to do his job. God knows things that we know nothing about. He sees things that we know nothing about. And he does things in a way that's for the best for our benefit. Likewise, his time frame as well. You know, sometimes we may think we may want something or need something in this time frame, but God turns around and goes, no. It will happen, but you've got to have some patience. It'll take some time. It's not an instant process. But too often we turn around to God and go, hey God, this is the problem, this is the solution. Can you like snap your fingers and so that it's all done right now, all good, well and proper? It's not how it works. God answers prayers. God helps you. But he does it in his way and in his time. And the sooner we come to terms with that, the sooner we accept that, the easier it is for us to be able to deal with God and be able to do the things that God says, because I can turn around and then say and go, okay, God, you've asked me to do this. I may not understand it. It might be scary. It might be horrible. It might be whatever. But you said you were going to sort it out. I'm going to trust you and I'm going to let you sort it out, even though it doesn't make sense to me at this point in time. The Bible tells us that when we get to heaven, God's going to pull back the curtain and he's going to give us our life story. He's going to show us everything and go, hey, remember when you did this? This is what happened in the background. Remember when you did this? This is what I was doing. Remember when you did this? Here's how I was working. We will find out eventually all the bits and pieces and details, but we have to wait for heaven to get that full story. In the meantime, we have to trust God that He's not going to kill us, He's not going to destroy us, but that He actually loves us and has our best interests in heart, and that He's fighting on our behalf. This world, this battle, this cosmic conflict, dealing with the devil, with problems, with issues, isn't something that God wants us to do by ourselves. Instead, He turns around and says, if you want to be victorious, you need me. You need Jesus to go before you to fight your battles. And if you let Jesus fight your battles, amazing things will happen. I have this saying, and I think it sort of sums up what we've been saying today, that I've come up over the years. Let go and let God. Amen.